The bikers swaggered into Jack's diner like they owned it, their heavy boots clomping on the old wooden floor, the sound cutting through the soft murmur of conversation. The door swung shut behind them with a loud creak, leaving a trail of silence in their wake. Heads turned, and regulars instinctively lowered their gazes, pretending to focus on their coffee or newspapers. The air grew tense, like the diner itself was holding its breath. Emily Dawson stood behind the counter, her back straight, pen poised over her notepad. She didn't flinch at the sudden change in atmosphere. She had seen this type before, loud, cocky, and always looking for someone to intimidate. She'd grown up watching her father, a man who could silence a room with just a look, handle men like these with precision and calm. "Hey, sweetheart," one of the bikers called out, his voice dripping with mock charm. He leaned over the counter, a greasy smirk stretched across his face, his eyes scanning her like she was part of the menu. Emily didn't look up right away. Instead, she finished writing down Mr. Baker's order: scrambled eggs and toast, hold the butter, then slowly turned her attention to the man leaning too close. Her polite smile barely touched her lips as she met his gaze. "Good afternoon," she said evenly. "What can I get for you?" The man chuckled, glancing over his shoulder at his companions, who were already sliding into the booth nearest the window, their laughter grating against the diner's usual calm. "What can you get for me?" he repeated, mocking her tone. "How about some better service? A smile wouldn't hurt either." Emily's smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes hardened. She could feel the weight of the other customers' stares, some sympathetic, others simply curious. Mr. Baker shifted in his seat, his frail hands trembling slightly as he reached for his coffee. Emily glanced at him briefly, her protective instincts kicking in. "I'll be with you in just a moment," she said, her voice calm and measured. She turned back to the coffee pot, filling a fresh cup for Mrs. Langley, who sat at the counter every morning with her crossword puzzle. The elderly woman gave Emily a worried look, her pen hovering over the page. The biker straightened, clearly not used to being brushed off. "You're a feisty one, huh?" he said, louder this time. His friends hollered from their booth, egging him on. "I like that. Tell you what, sweetheart, why don't you bring me a coffee black? And don't take all day." Emily nodded, turning to grab a clean mug. Her movements were steady, deliberate. Inside, her mind raced, calculating every detail: the way his friends were sprawled out, their jackets patched with symbols she didn't recognize, the way the man at the counter drummed his fingers, his impatience growing. She placed the coffee in front of him, her hands as steady as ever. "Here you go," she said, her tone neutral. The man grinned, leaning in closer. "See? That wasn't so hard, was it?" Emily stepped back, her expression unchanged. She had been taught to pick her battles carefully. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, "Never show fear. Never let them see the fight in you until it's too late." The man took a long sip of his coffee, his eyes still fixed on her. "Not bad," he said, slamming the mug down on the counter. "But I think it's missing something." He reached for the sugar dispenser, knocking it over intentionally. The small glass container rolled across the counter, spilling its contents onto the polished surface. Emily's smile tightened. She grabbed a cloth, moving to clean up the mess without a word. The man watched her, clearly enjoying the attention. "Careful there, sweetheart," he said, his tone mocking. "Wouldn't want you to strain yourself." At that moment, the door to the kitchen swung open, and George, the diner's cook, poked his head out. His eyes flicked to the scene at the counter, then to Emily. She gave him the faintest shake of her head, a silent signal to stay put. She didn't need backup. Not yet. The bikers continued their banter, their voices growing louder as they settled into their seats. Emily moved through the diner with practiced ease, refilling coffee cups, taking orders, and keeping a close eye on the situation. She noticed everything: the way one of the bikers tapped his knife against the table, the way another kept glancing toward the counter where she stood. They were testing her, pushing boundaries to see how far they could go. But Emily had learned to wait. Her father had drilled it into her since she was a child: patience was a weapon. You never acted too soon, never let your emotions take control. The strongest person in the room wasn't the one who yelled the loudest or threw the first punch, it was the one who stayed calm, who waited for the right moment to strike. Behind her, the old radio crackled to life, a faint static filling the room before a news report cut through. Authorities are advising caution after reports of increased activity among local biker gangs. Emily's eyes flicked to the chrome coffee maker, where she caught the reflection of the man at the counter. His smirk hadn't wavered, but there was something in his posture: a slight tension, a challenge. He wanted a reaction. She wouldn't give him one. The tension in the diner was palpable now, the air heavy with unspoken words. Regulars whispered among themselves, their voices hushed. Mr. Baker kept glancing toward the door, as if considering making an early exit. But Emily stood firm. She wasn't just a waitress, not really. Her father had taught her everything he knew, and those lessons had become second nature. She wasn't afraid of these men. She wasn't afraid of anyone. And if they thought they could walk into her diner and throw their weight around, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The man at the counter tapped his fingers impatiently, his knuckles brushing the edge of the coffee cup. Emily noticed every detail: the frayed seams of his leather jacket, the crude tattoos that snaked up his arms, the way his smirk seemed plastered on, masking something darker beneath. But she didn't falter. Behind her, George peeked out from the kitchen again. His bulk filled the doorway, and his face was a mix of concern and frustration. He didn't like troublemakers, and he didn't like them messing with Emily. "Everything okay out there?" he called, his voice gruff. Emily turned her head slightly, offering him the briefest of smiles. "Fine, George," she said. "Just a couple of new customers." George didn't look convinced, but he knew better than to argue. Emily had her way of handling things, and he'd learned to trust her instincts. The leader of the group, Rick, as one of his companions called him, caught the exchange and laughed. It wasn't a friendly laugh, it was the kind meant to unsettle, to make it clear who thought they were in charge. Well, Rick drawled, leaning back on his stool. "Seems like you've got your knight in shining armor back there. What's his deal?" "Kitchen cop." The other bikers snickered, their laughter sharp and grating. Emily ignored them, calmly wiping down the counter where the sugar had spilled. She could feel their eyes on her, trying to gauge her reaction, waiting for her to crack. But she wouldn't. Her father had always said there were two kinds of people in a standoff: the ones who talked the loudest, and the ones who walked away victorious. Emily knew exactly which kind she was. Rick wasn't finished, though. He leaned forward again, his grin widening as he tried to close the gap between them. "You're awfully quiet, sweetheart," he said, his voice low. "Don't you have anything to say?" Emily straightened, her cloth folded neatly in her hands. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I've found it's better to let actions speak," she said simply, then turned to grab a fresh pot of coffee. The statement wasn't much, but it hit harder than Rick expected. For a moment, his smirk faltered. The other bikers exchanged glances, the unspoken question clear: was this waitress really as meek as she seemed? Rick wasn't one to back down, though. If anything, her calmness only spurred him on. "Actions, huh," he said, leaning back in his seat. "Well, sweetheart, let me show you some action." He grabbed the coffee mug in front of him and tipped it over, the dark liquid spilling across the counter and dripping onto the floor. The sound of the splash was loud in the silence that followed. A collective gasp rippled through the diner as the regulars watched, their shock mirrored on their faces. Emily didn't flinch. She grabbed another cloth, moving to clean up the mess without a word. Her movements were steady, controlled. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her upset. Rick laughed again, the sound grating against her ears. "You're a tough one, huh? I like that." Behind her, the door to the kitchen swung open again, this time with more force. George stepped out, his arms crossed over his chest. His expression was grim, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice heavy with warning. Rick didn't even glance at him. His focus was entirely on Emily. "No problem," he said, his tone mocking. "Just having a little fun with your girl here." George took a step forward, his large frame casting a shadow across the counter. "She's not here for your fun," he said sharply. "You've had your coffee. Time to move along." Rick's grin widened, but his eyes narrowed. He turned slowly, sizing George up. The tension in the room was palpable now, thick enough to cut with a knife. "I don't think you understand," Rick said, his voice low and dangerous. "We're not going anywhere until we're good and ready." Emily stepped in before George could respond. "It's fine, George," she said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "I've got this." George hesitated, his jaw tight. He didn't like it, but he nodded, stepping back toward the kitchen. He kept the door open this time, though, lingering just out of sight. Rick turned back to Emily, his smirk firmly in place. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" he said. "Most girls would have run off by now." Emily picked up the coffee pot, pouring a fresh cup for Mrs. Langley without so much as a glance in his direction. "I guess I'm not most girls," she said evenly. Rick's laughter filled the room again, but this time it was strained, like he wasn't entirely sure who was in control anymore. Across the diner, Mr. Baker shifted in his seat, his gaze darting between Emily and the bikers. His frail hands trembled as he reached for his cane, and Emily's heart tightened. She couldn't let this escalate, not here, not with people like Mr. Baker and Mrs. Langley caught in the middle. But she also couldn't let these men think they could walk all over her. Her father's lessons echoed in her mind: stay calm. Stay focused. And when the moment comes, don't hesitate. Rick pushed his chair back suddenly, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. He stood, towering over the counter, and leaned in close, his face inches from Emily's. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, his voice a low growl. "But I wonder how far that'll get you." Emily didn't back away. She met his gaze head on, her expression steady. "As far as I needed to," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. For a moment, Rick just stared at her, as if trying to figure out what made her so unflinching. Then he laughed a short, sharp bark of amusement. "You're something else, sweetheart," he said, stepping back. "But don't think for a second that means we're done here." He turned and sauntered back to his booth, his companions laughing and slapping him on the back. Emily watched him go, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. This wasn't over. She could feel the eyes of the regulars on her, their unspoken questions heavy in the air. But Emily didn't offer any answers. She simply picked up the cloth and went back to cleaning the counter, her movements as steady as ever. Her father's voice echoed in her mind again, steady and reassuring: "Wait for the right moment. Let them make the first mistake." Emily had a feeling that moment was coming soon. The tension in the diner thickened like smoke, stifling the usual chatter of regulars and the clink of coffee cups. The bikers lounged in their seats, their leather jackets creaking with every exaggerated shift. They were testing the boundaries of the room, seeing how much discomfort they could create, feeding off the unease. Rick, the group's leader, sat at the counter, his elbows sprawled wide as if to stake his claim. His presence was invasive, his every move demanding attention. Emily stood behind the counter, her pen poised over her notepad, her expression unreadable. "You know," Rick drawled, his voice low and mocking, "a little smile wouldn't kill you, sweetheart. We came here for some service, not attitude." His words hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in condescension. His companions laughed, their voices loud and rough, filling the silence like nails scraping against a chalkboard. Emily's expression didn't waver, but her chest tightened. She had dealt with men like Rick before, the kind who mistook politeness for submission and saw any restraint as weakness. But she had learned to read their tells, the way Rick's fingers drummed impatiently on the counter, the way his eyes lingered on her, searching for a crack in her composure. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone steady, neutral. Her voice carried no trace of fear, only the practiced calm her father had instilled in her during countless lessons. Rick tilted his head, pretending to think it over. What do you think, boys?" he asked, turning to his crew. "What should we have? Maybe she can whip us up something special." One of the bikers, a wiry man with a snake tattoo coiled around his neck, smirked. "How about some respect, for starters?" he said, his voice laced with mockery. More laughter followed, louder this time. Emily glanced toward the booths where the regulars sat. Mrs. Langley clutched her crossword puzzle a little too tightly, her eyes darting between Emily and the bikers. Mr. Baker shifted uncomfortably, his frail hand shaking as he reached for his cane. Emily's gaze flicked back to Rick. She wasn't just protecting herself, she was protecting everyone in the diner. "Coffee?" she asked, ignoring the insults. "Or something else?" Rick leaned closer, invading her space. The smell of stale cigarettes and leather wafted toward her. "Coffee's a start," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "But make sure it's fresh. None of that bottom of the pot crap." Emily turned without a word, grabbing a clean mug and the freshly brewed pot from the warmer. Her movements were deliberate, her hands steady. She filled the cup and placed it in front of him, careful not to spill a drop. Rick stared at the coffee for a moment before looking up at her, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're real quiet, aren't you?" he said. "I like that. Means you know your place." Emily's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but she kept her expression neutral. She wouldn't give him the reaction he was fishing for. Rick took a sip of the coffee, his eyes never leaving hers. He smacked his lips theatrically and set the mug down with a clatter. "Not bad," he said, leaning back. "But like I said earlier, a little smile wouldn't hurt." He reached out suddenly, his fingers grazing her wrist. The touch was brief, but it was enough to send a ripple of shock through the room. George, the cook, stepped halfway out of the kitchen, his broad frame blocking the doorway. "That's enough," he barked, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Rick didn't even glance at him. His attention was locked on Emily, waiting to see what she would do. Emily pulled her hand back, calm and controlled. Her father's words echoed in her mind, "Stay steady. Don't show fear. Let them make the first mistake." "Anything else I can get you?" she asked, her voice firm but polite. Rick laughed, the sound loud and abrasive. He leaned back in his stool, spreading his arms wide. "Nah, I think we're good for now," he said, casting a smug glance at his crew. "Just here to relax, enjoy the scenery." The other bikers snickered, their eyes flicking toward Emily. Across the diner, Mrs. Langley stood abruptly, clutching her purse. "I think I'll be heading out," she murmured, her voice trembling. Emily gave her a reassuring nod. "I'll wrap up your pie to go," she said softly, stepping to the counter's edge to box up the half-eaten slice. She placed the box in Mrs. Langley's hands, her fingers brushing the older woman's briefly. "Take care, Mrs. Langley." As Mrs. Langley hurried out the door, Rick watched her go, his grin widening. "Looks like we're scaring off your customers," he said, his tone mock innocent. That's a shame. Emily didn't respond. Instead, she moved to refill Mr. Baker's coffee, her action slow and deliberate. "Don't worry about me, miss," Mr. Baker whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll be fine." Emily offered him a small, reassuring smile. "You just enjoy your coffee, Mr. Baker," she said quietly. Rick's voice cut through the room again. "You're real good at ignoring people, you know that," he said. "Makes a guy feel unimportant." Emily turned back to him, her expression calm but unyielding. "I'm just doing my job," she said evenly. Rick's smirk faltered for the briefest moment before he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And what happens when you can't just do your job anymore? When someone decides to make things difficult for you?" The unspoken threat hung in the air, heavy and menacing. Emily's father's voice rang in her mind, "Tension is just a waiting game. The one who stays calm wins." "I'd say," Emily replied, her voice steady, "that making things difficult doesn't always work out the way people think it will." Rick's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, his cocky demeanor slipped. Then he laughed, shaking his head as if amused. "You've got guts, sweetheart," he said. "I'll give you that." He leaned back, gesturing to his crew. "Let's settle in, boys. Looks like we're gonna be here a while." The other bikers cheered, their voices booming across the diner. Emily glanced toward the kitchen, catching George's concerned gaze. He nodded slightly, as if to say, "I'm here if you need me." But Emily didn't need backup. Not yet. She stepped behind the counter, her movements precise and controlled. Her father had always told her that composure was her greatest weapon. And she intended to use it. The minutes stretched on, the bikers growing louder, their laughter sharp and grating. Emily kept working, her every action deliberate, her mind focused. They didn't know who they were dealing with. But they would. Rick tapped his fingers against the counter, the rhythm erratic and loud, like a drum beat meant to unsettle. His gaze remained fixed on Emily, the smirk never fully leaving his face. Behind him, the rest of the bikers had sprawled out across the booths, their boots propped on tables, their voices filling the diner with crude jokes and booming laughter. The regulars sat stiffly in their seats, trying to act as if they weren't watching every move. Emily could feel their eyes flicking between her and the bikers, their unease thick in the air. Even George, who usually stayed calm under pressure, looked ready to charge out of the kitchen at a moment's notice. Rick grabbed his coffee mug, spinning it idly between his fingers. "So, tell me, sweetheart," he said, breaking the silence. "You always work alone, or is your backup hiding in the back?" Emily didn't miss the implication, but she kept her voice steady. "I've got everything under control," she replied. Rick chuckled. "Oh, I bet you do," he said, setting the mug down with a loud clink. "But what happens when things get out of control? You got someone to call? Someone to bail you out?" The tension in the diner spiked. Emily noticed George step closer to the kitchen doorway, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched. "I'm used to handling things on my own," Emily said calmly, pouring coffee for another table. "But thanks for your concern." Rick's smirk widened. "Feisty. I like that." Across the room, one of the bikers, an older man with a gray beard and a faded skull tattoo on his neck, nudged a plate of pancakes off his table. The plate shattered on the floor, the sound echoing through the diner. "Oops," the man said with a mock apologetic grin. "Guess I'm clumsy today." Emily turned slowly, her eyes locking onto the biker. Her expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of steel behind her gaze. She grabbed a broom and dustpan from the corner, walking over to the shattered plate. As she knelt to clean up the mess, the gray-bearded man leaned forward. "You're a real hard worker, aren't you?" he said, his voice dripping with mock admiration. Bet you're used to cleaning up other people's messes. Emily straightened, meeting his gaze head on. Someone has to, she said evenly, her tone giving nothing away. The man laughed, a low, grating sound. That's the spirit. Rick watched the exchange with amusement, his fingers drumming against the counter again. You've got a lot of patience, he said to Emily, his tone half taunting, half admiring. I respect that. Most people would have snapped by now. Emily carried the dustpan to the trash, her movements deliberate. She wasn't about to let them get to her. Patience pays off, she said, her voice calm. Rick leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Does it now? He asked, his eyes narrowing. What's it paying you, sweetheart? A few tips? A pat on the back. Emily didn't respond. She grabbed a fresh rag and began wiping down the counter, her focus unbroken. Rick's smirk faltered slightly. He wasn't used to being ignored. Behind him, another biker, a wiry man with sharp features and a snake tattoo winding up his arm, stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked to the jukebox in the corner, slamming his fist against it. The machine whirred to life, blaring a raucous rock song that drowned out the quiet hum of the diner. The sound startled Mrs. Langley, who had returned to retrieve the umbrella she'd left behind. She froze in place, clutching her handbag tightly. Little loud, don't you think? Emily said, her voice still calm but firm. The snake-tattooed man turned to her, his grin wide and unkind. What's the matter? Don't like good music? Emily met his gaze without flinching. Not when it disrupts my customers, she said. Rick laughed, clapping his hands together. Oh, she's got fire, doesn't she? He said, looking around at his crew. I think I'm starting to like this place. The bikers cheered in agreement, their voices blending with the music in a cacophony of sound. Emily glanced toward Mr. Baker, who was struggling to rise from his booth. His hands trembled as he gripped his cane, his discomfort plain on his face. I'll help you to the door, Mr. Baker, Emily said gently, stepping around the counter. As she approached, Rick's voice cut through the noise. What's the rush? He called. We're just getting started. Emily ignored him, focusing on Mr. Baker. Take your time, she said softly, helping him to his feet. Rick's amusement faded slightly as he watched her. There was something in the way she moved, something steady and deliberate, that unsettled him. Hey, he called, his tone sharper now. I'm talking to you. Emily didn't stop. She guided Mr. Baker to the door, opening it for him and watching as he shuffled out to his car. When she turned back, Rick was on his feet, his smirk replaced by a scowl. You've got some nerve, he said, his voice low. Emily walked back to the counter, her expression calm but unyielding. I have a job to do, she said simply. Rick leaned over the counter, his face inches from hers. And what happens, he said slowly, when your job gets a little dangerous? The room fell silent, the bikers watching intently. The regulars who remained sat frozen in their seats, their fear palpable. Emily didn't flinch. She met Rick's gaze head on, her voice steady. I guess we'll find out. For a moment, Rick just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he chuckled, shaking his head. You're something else, he said, stepping back. He turned to his crew, waving a hand dismissively. Let's give the lady a break, he said, his tone mocking. Don't want to scare her too much. The bikers laughed, their voices loud and grating. But as Rick sat back down, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this waitress than met the eye. And Emily. She knew it was only a matter of time before they pushed too far. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, let them come to you. Stay calm. Stay ready. The storm was building, and Emily was prepared. The atmosphere in the diner grew heavier with every passing second, like a taut rope ready to snap. Rick and his crew showed no signs of leaving, their presence a relentless source of irritation and intimidation. Emily continued her work, her expression calm, her movements steady, but her patience was wearing thin. Rick swiped at a sugar dispenser, sending it skidding across the counter. The small metal container wobbled precariously before clattering to the floor. He leaned back on his stool, smirking. "You're quick on your feet, aren't you, sweetheart? Why don't you grab that for me?" Emily's eyes flicked to the fallen sugar dispenser, but she made no move to retrieve it. Instead, she grabbed a clean rag and began wiping down the counter. "I'll get to it in a minute," she said evenly. Rick's smirk widened. "Too busy for us, huh? You know, most waitresses would jump at the chance to serve a group like us. Don't you know how to treat paying customers?" His crew laughed, their voices loud and grating, as if their own humor was the most important thing in the world. Emily stayed silent, her grip tightening on the rag in her hand. She had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than words. Behind her, the diner's ancient radio crackled with static before a voice broke through. "Local authorities are advising caution after reports of a biker gang causing disturbances in nearby towns. Citizens are urged to stay vigilant and avoid confrontation." The announcement trailed off, overtaken by more static, but it was enough to make Emily pause. Her eyes flicked toward the reflection of the bikers in the chrome coffee maker behind the counter. They didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they didn't care. Rick grabbed a salt shaker this time, tossing it from one hand to the other. "You hear that, boys?" he said, his voice loud and mocking. "Sounds like we've got a reputation." The others roared with laughter, pounding their fists on the tables. Emily didn't react. She finished wiping the counter and reached for the coffee pot. "Anyone need a refill?" she asked, her tone neutral. Rick's smirk faltered for a split second, as if her indifference unsettled him. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. "You've got some guts, I'll give you that," he said. "Most people would be shaking in their boots right now." Emily poured coffee into his mug, her movements precise. "Most people don't know how to handle themselves," she replied, her voice steady. Rick raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh yeah? And you do?" Emily didn't answer. She placed the coffee pot back on the warmer and moved to refill another table's cups. She could feel Rick's eyes on her, searching for a reaction, but she refused to give him one. Behind her, another biker, a burly man with a thick beard and a scar running down his cheek, grabbed a glass from his table and sent it rolling across the counter. It hit the edge and fell, shattering into pieces on the floor. "Oops," he said, grinning. "Better clean that up, sweetheart." Emily paused, her eyes lingering on the shards of glass. She bent down slowly, grabbing a broom and dustpan from under the counter. Her movements were deliberate, controlled. She wasn't just cleaning up a mess, she was assessing, planning. As she swept up the glass, Rick leaned over the counter, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "You don't scare easy, do you?" Emily straightened, meeting his gaze. "Should I be scared?" she asked, her voice calm but with a sharp edge that caught him off guard. For a moment, Rick said nothing. Then he laughed, shaking his head. "You're something else," he said, sitting back in his stool. Behind him, the other bikers continued their antics. One of them began flicking his cigarette ash onto the floor, while another shoved an empty plate off his table with a loud crash. Emily's eyes flicked toward George, who was still watching from the kitchen doorway. His broad shoulders were tense, his hands gripping the edge of the door frame. He looked ready to step in, but Emily gave him a subtle shake of her head. "Not yet." The diner's door creaked open, and a young couple stepped inside, their laughter fading as they took in the scene. The bikers turned to look at them, their grins predatory. Well, well, Rick said, his voice dripping with mock warmth. Looks like we've got more company. The couple hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. Emily stepped forward, placing herself between them and the bikers. Welcome, she said, her voice steady. Take a seat wherever you like. The couple hurried to a booth near the window, as far from the bikers as they could get. Emily grabbed 2 menus and brought them over, her movements calm and efficient. Rick watched her, his smirk returning. You're a real professional, aren't you? He called out. Always so polite. Makes me wonder what it would take to get under that skin of yours. Emily ignored him, handing the menus to the couple. Take your time, she said softly. I'll be back in a minute. As she walked back to the counter, Rick's voice followed her. You know, sweetheart, you've got a lot of patience. But I can't help wondering how long it'll last. Emily didn't respond. She grabbed a clean towel and began wiping down the counter again, her focus unbroken. But inside, her resolve was hardening. Every taunt, every insult, every act of disrespect, they were all pieces of a puzzle, building towards something inevitable. Rick knocked over another glass, the shards scattering across the counter this time. Oops, he said again, his grin widening. Emily set down the towel and grabbed the broom once more. As she swept up the broken glass, she caught the reflection of Rick's smirk in the chrome coffee maker. It was a look she had seen before, a look of someone who thought they were untouchable. But Rick didn't know her. He didn't know the lessons her father had taught her, the discipline she had learned, the strength she kept hidden beneath the surface. And he didn't know how quickly things could change. The afternoon wore on, and the bikers showed no sign of leaving. Their laughter and crude remarks filled the diner, drowning out the clink of plates and the soft murmur of the radio. Emily moved through the chaos like a steady current, calm and unyielding. She had faced storms before, this was just another one she had to weather. Rick leaned back in his stool, his arms stretched wide across the counter. You know, sweetheart, he drawled, it's a shame you're stuck in this little diner. A girl like you could go places with the right guidance. His tone was thick with mockery, but there was something sharper underneath, something that tested boundaries. Emily glanced at him, her expression neutral, and reached for the coffee pot. Another refill, she asked. Rick's grin widened. Sure. Maybe I'll drink enough to finally get a smile out of you. Emily poured the coffee without a word. She felt the weight of the regulars' eyes on her, their unspoken worry hanging in the air. In the corner booth, Mrs. Langley fidgeted with her handbag, her knuckles white as she clutched the strap. Across the room, the young couple sat stiffly, barely touching their food. Rick's hand shot out suddenly, brushing against Emily's wrist as she set the coffee pot down. What's the matter? He said, his voice low. You too good to talk to us? Emily pulled her hand back smoothly, her movements calm and deliberate. I'm here to serve coffee, not conversation, she said, her voice steady. The room fell silent for a moment, the tension so thick it felt like it could snap at any second. Then Rick laughed, a loud, booming sound that made the regulars flinch. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he said, shaking his head. Most people wouldn't dare talk back to me. Emily didn't respond. She picked up a tray of empty plates and carried them to the kitchen, her back straight, her pace measured. As she passed George, who stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, she gave him a small nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him from stepping in. Not yet, her nod seemed to say. Back in the dining area, Rick turned to his crew, his grin fading slightly. What do you think, boys? Is she playing hard to get, or is she just plain hard? The bikers laughed, their voices grating against the walls of the small diner. One of them, a wiry man with a patchy beard and dark, piercing eyes, stood up and wandered over to the counter. He picked up a salt shaker, rolling it between his fingers like a magician preparing for a trick. Maybe she needs a little persuasion, the man said, his voice oily. He tilted the salt shaker, letting the grains spill onto the counter in a messy heap. Oops. Guess I made a mess. Emily returned from the kitchen just in time to see the pile of salt spreading across the counter. She grabbed a clean rag and began wiping it up without a word, her movements efficient and unbothered. The wiry man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You're real good at cleaning up after us, aren't you? Bet you've had plenty of practice. Emily straightened, her eyes meeting his. For a split second, something flickered in her gaze, something sharp and unyielding. The man stepped back, as if he had seen it, too, but he quickly masked his unease with a grin. You're no fun, he muttered, slinking back to his seat. Rick watched the exchange, his eyes narrowing slightly. You're full of surprises, aren't you, he said, his tone more curious than mocking now. Makes me wonder what else you're hiding. Emily didn't answer. She picked up the salt shaker, refilled it, and set it back on the counter. Then she moved on to the next task, her focus unbroken. The radio crackled again, the static filling the room like a warning. Emily glanced at it briefly, her mind replaying the earlier announcement. Avoid confrontation. She almost smiled at the irony. Confrontation wasn't something she avoided, it was something she prepared for. As the afternoon turned into evening, the bikers grew bolder. They knocked over glasses, spilled drinks, and made loud, crude jokes that echoed through the diner. The regulars who had stayed behind were visibly uncomfortable, their unease growing with every passing minute. Emily noticed it all, the way Mrs. Langley kept glancing at the door, the way Mr. Baker's hands trembled as he fumbled with his wallet, the way the young couple whispered urgently to each other, their eyes darting toward the exit. Emily moved between tables, refilling drinks and clearing plates as if nothing was amiss. But she was watching, always watching. She saw the way Rick's smirk faltered every time she ignored his taunts. She saw the way the wiry man with the salt shaker glanced at her when he thought she wasn't looking, his grin now tinged with uncertainty. And she saw the way the scarred man with the cigarette kept flicking ash onto the floor, his movements growing more erratic. They were testing her, pushing boundaries to see how far they could go. But what they didn't realize was that she was testing them, too. Rick reached across the counter again, grabbing a handful of sugar packets and tossing them into the air like confetti. Looks like we're out of sugar, he said with a grin. Mind grabbing some more, sweetheart? Emily turned to him, her expression unreadable. Sure, she said, her voice calm. She walked to the storeroom, her steps measured and precise. Inside, she leaned against the shelf, taking a deep breath. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. The lessons her father had drilled into her echoed in her mind. Stay calm. Stay ready. Control the situation, don't let it control you. She grabbed a box of sugar packets and returned to the counter, setting it down in front of Rick. Here you go, she said simply. Rick blinked, as if he had expected a different reaction. You're real good at keeping your cool, he said, his voice quieter now. But I wonder how long that'll last. Emily didn't respond. She opened the box and began restocking the sugar dispensers, her movements steady and deliberate. The bikers were getting restless. Their jokes grew louder, their gestures more aggressive. The scarred man with the cigarette knocked over his chair, the noise startling everyone in the diner. You're out of ashtrays, he growled, his tone accusatory. Emily walked over to his table, picking up the chair and setting it upright. We don't allow smoking inside, she said firmly. The man's eyes narrowed. You gonna stop me, he said, his voice a low growl. The room went silent. Even Rick turned to watch, his expression curious. Emily didn't flinch. I'm just asking you to follow the rules, she said calmly. The scarred man stared at her for a long moment, then laughed a harsh, humorless sound. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, tossing the cigarette onto the floor and grinding it out with his boot. "But guts won't save you." Rick leaned back in his stool, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" he said, his voice almost admiring. "Makes me wonder what else you're hiding." Emily didn't respond. She grabbed the broom and swept up the cigarette, her movements calm and controlled. But inside, she was bracing herself. The storm was building. And Emily was ready. Rick leaned back in his chair, toying with a toothpick between his fingers. His eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked across the room. The tension had reached a boiling point. The regulars sat frozen, their uneaten meals cold on their plates. Even George, who normally would have stepped in by now, lingered behind the kitchen door, his face a mix of frustration and worry. Rick's grin spread wider as he turned to Emily. "You've got nerve, I'll give you that," he said, his voice slick with condescension. "But nerve only gets you so far." He reached out, grabbing her wrist as she set a cup of coffee on the counter. His grip was firm, deliberate, the kind of gesture meant to intimidate. But instead of pulling away, Emily froze. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Her gaze met his, steady and unyielding. "Let go," she said, her voice low and calm. Rick's smirk deepened. "What are you gonna do if I don't?" he taunted, squeezing tighter. In a blur of movement, Emily twisted her wrist free and flipped his arm back. The crack of his hand hitting the counter echoed through the diner, followed by his startled yell. "What the hell?" one of the bikers started, but his words were cut short as Emily stepped out from behind the counter. Her posture had changed. Gone was the quiet, unassuming waitress. Now she stood tall, her movements precise, her stance balanced. She looked each of them in the eye, daring them to make their next move. Rick staggered to his feet, cradling his wrist. His expression shifted from smug to furious. "You're gonna regret that," he spat, lunging toward her. But Emily was faster. With a swift motion, she sidestepped his attack, catching his arm and twisting it behind his back. A sharp grunt of pain escaped his lips as she pushed him toward the counter, pinning him effortlessly. "I warned you," she said evenly, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. The regulars stared in shock, their disbelief written across their faces. Mrs. Langley clutched her purse tightly, her eyes wide. The young couple leaned forward, barely breathing. Even George peeked out from the kitchen, his jaw slack. Rick's crew looked at each other, their bravado faltering. The wiry man with the salt shaker stood up, his hands curling into fists. "She's just a girl," he growled. "She got lucky." Emily released Rick, letting him stumble back into a chair. She turned to the wiry man, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Try me," she said, her tone calm but dangerous. He hesitated, glancing at his comrades for reassurance. But the other bikers stayed seated, their confidence shaken. Finally, he lunged toward her, his movements wild and uncoordinated. Emily moved with practiced precision. She stepped to the side, grabbing his arm and using his own momentum to throw him off balance. He hit the floor hard, the air rushing out of his lungs in a loud gasp. "That one's for my dad," she said, brushing her hands off. Rick struggled to his feet, his face twisted in anger and humiliation. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking. Emily crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "The daughter of a Navy SEAL," she said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "My father taught me everything he knew," she continued, her voice steady. "How to stay calm under pressure. How to handle myself in a fight. How to protect the people who can't protect themselves." She glanced around the diner, her eyes briefly meeting those of the regulars. "And that includes everyone in this room." The scarred man with the cigarette stood up, his expression wary. "We didn't come here for a fight," he said, raising his hands. "Rick, maybe we should go." Rick glared at him, then back at Emily. His pride was wounded, but even he could see the tide had turned. "This isn't over," he muttered, grabbing his leather jacket and storming toward the door. "Yeah, it is," Emily said firmly, her gaze following him. One by one, the bikers followed Rick out of the diner, their swagger gone. The door creaked shut behind them, leaving the room in stunned silence. Emily exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from her body. She turned to George, who had finally stepped out of the kitchen, a look of awe on his face. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. "Emily, that was incredible," he finally managed. The regulars began to stir, their shock giving way to relief. Mrs. Langley smiled nervously, her hands still shaking. Mr. Baker gave Emily a small nod of approval, his eyes twinkling with newfound respect. The young couple whispered to each other, then stood up, approaching Emily hesitantly. "That was amazing," the woman said. "Thank you." Emily smiled faintly. "Just doing what needed to be done," she said. As the adrenaline faded, Emily returned to her usual tasks, cleaning up the mess the bikers had left behind. But something had shifted. The regulars watched her with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. George approached her, his hands stuffed into his apron pockets. "You never told me your dad was a SEAL," he said. Emily shrugged. "It didn't seem relevant," she said, stacking a pile of plates. "Well, remind me never to get on your bad side," he said with a chuckle. Emily smirked. "You'll be fine as long as you don't call me sweetheart." The room erupted in laughter, the tension finally broken. As Emily stepped outside to take a breath of fresh air, she glanced down the road where the bikers had disappeared. She knew they might cause trouble somewhere else, but not here. Not again. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, "The strongest weapon you have isn't your fists or your training, it's your discipline. Control the fight, and you'll always come out on top." She smiled to herself, the weight of the day lifting. Sometimes, people underestimated the quiet ones. But that was their mistake. Emily adjusted her apron and stepped back to the counter, her calm demeanor returning as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But for the bikers still lingering near the door, the air was charged with something new: uncertainty. Rick leaned against the doorway, rubbing his sore wrist, his face flushed with embarrassment. His pride was bruised, but his need to assert dominance hadn't faded. "You think this is funny," he growled, his voice low but dangerous. "Knocking us around like you're some kind of hero." Emily tilted her head, her eyes steady on him. "Funny? No. Necessary? Yes." Rick's lip curled into a sneer. He took a step forward, but his crew hesitated behind him, exchanging nervous glances. The wiry man who'd been thrown to the floor earlier was still catching his breath, and the scarred man had already begun edging toward the exit. "Don't just stand there." Rick barked at his men. "Get her." It was a direct command, but none of the bikers moved. Their hesitation was palpable. "You saw what she did," the scarred man muttered under his breath, his eyes darting to Emily like she was a coiled snake. Rick snarled, grabbing the nearest man by the collar. "What are you, cowards?" "Not cowards," Emily interjected, her voice calm but firm. "Smart enough to know when they're outmatched." The quiet confidence in her tone sent a ripple through the room. Rick's gaze snapped back to her, his fury intensifying. "You think you're better than us," he spat. Emily didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer, her movements deliberate. "No, Rick. I don't think I'm better. I know I am." The words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. Rick scoffed, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Emily seized the moment. "My father spent 20 years serving this country," she began, her voice steady and unwavering. "He wasn't just a Navy SEAL, he was one of the best. And he taught me everything he knew." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Discipline. Strategy. Strength. He taught me how to fight not just with my fists, but with my mind." Her gaze swept across the room, making eye contact with each of the bikers in turn. "So, let me give you some advice, pick your battles wisely. Because this isn't a fight you're going to win." The scarred man shuffled uncomfortably, his hand gripping the back of a chair for support. "She's right, Rick. We're done here." Rick's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "You're all a bunch of cowards," he growled, but his voice lacked the conviction it had before. Emily took another step forward, her posture relaxed but purposeful. "Walk away, Rick," she said. "While you still can." For a moment, it seemed like Rick might listen. His eyes darted to his crew, then back to Emily. The tension was unbearable, the entire diner holding its breath. But Rick wasn't the type to back down easily. With a sudden burst of rage, he lunged at her, his hands outstretched. Emily had been waiting for this. In a fluid motion, she sidestepped his attack, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. Using his momentum against him, she pushed him forward, sending him crashing into a table. The impact sent plates and cups flying, the noise echoing through the diner. Rick groaned in pain, struggling to push himself up. Emily stood over him, her stance firm. "This ends now," she said, her voice calm but commanding. The bikers froze, their expressions a mix of fear and respect. They had seen enough. "Let's get out of here," the scarred man muttered, nudging the wiry man toward the door. One by one, the bikers began to retreat, their arrogance replaced by quiet defeat. As the door slammed shut behind them, a collective sigh of relief swept through the diner. The regulars, who had been paralyzed by fear moments ago, began to stir. Mrs. Langley clutched her chest, her eyes wide. "My goodness, Emily," she whispered. "I had no idea." Mr. Baker gave her a shaky thumbs up from his booth. "That was impressive," he said, his voice trembling with awe. George emerged from the kitchen, a dish towel slung over his shoulder. "Emily, remind me to never get on your bad side," he said with a nervous laugh. Emily smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "They won't be back," she said simply, her tone matter of fact. The young couple approached her hesitantly. "You saved us," the woman said, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you." Emily nodded. "Just doing what needed to be done." As the diner began to return to normal, Emily took a moment to herself. She stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. The road was empty now, the rumble of motorcycle engines a distant memory. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, "Strength isn't about proving you're the toughest in the room. It's about protecting what matters most." She smiled to herself, the weight of the day lifting. She knew her father would be proud. Behind her, George stepped out, his hands stuffed into his apron pockets. "You know," he said, "you really should have told me about all this Navy SEAL training. Would have saved me a lot of worrying." Emily chuckled. "Where's the fun in that?" George shook his head with a grin. "Well, remind me to put you on the night shift more often. You've got the place covered." Emily looked out at the quiet street, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, people underestimate you," she said softly. "But that's their mistake." The events of the evening had left an indelible mark on everyone in the diner. Emily's quiet strength had not only protected them but also inspired them. Mrs. Langley approached her as she refilled the coffee pots. "You know, dear," she said, her voice warm, "your father raised you right. Emily smiled, her chest swelling with pride. "He taught me to stand up for what's right," she replied. As the last customer left and the diner grew quiet, Emily locked the door and turned off the lights. The day had been long, but it had been worth it. Stepping outside, she looked up at the stars, her father's words still echoing in her mind. The strongest people are the ones who know when to fight and when to walk away. With a deep breath, Emily walked home, the faint sound of laughter and gratitude still ringing in her ears. The bikers stumbled to their feet, still dazed and shaken. Their confidence had evaporated, replaced by the bitter sting of humiliation. Rick, the leader, was clutching his wrist, the pain still radiating from the sharp twist Emily had delivered. His face was flushed, his mouth set in a tight line, but his eyes were full of something else, something raw, something that had never been directed at her before. Fear. The other bikers, who had been so quick to show their dominance moments ago, now looked like lost boys. Their bravado was gone. One of them, the wiry man who had been thrown to the floor earlier, adjusted his leather vest and quickly avoided Emily's gaze. The scarred man shifted from foot to foot, clearly eager to leave. Emily didn't move. She stayed exactly where she was, her posture unyielding. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. She stared at Rick, her eyes unwavering. Her silence spoke volumes, a message he could feel down to his bones. "Apologize," she said, her voice cool, calm, but firm. Rick's eyes flashed with anger, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. Something in Emily's gaze held him back, something he couldn't name. His chest heaved with frustration, but there was no denying the defeat that had taken hold of him. "I said apologize," Emily repeated, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "You were rude. You were disrespectful. And you will apologize for that." Rick opened his mouth as though to argue, but the words caught in his throat. He glanced around the room, his eyes meeting the gaze of the other patrons. They weren't just bystanders anymore, they were witnesses to the change happening in that small diner. Emily wasn't just the waitress behind the counter. She was someone who had stood her ground, someone who had shown them what true strength looked like. Rick muttered something under his breath, a jumble of words that was almost impossible to hear over the murmur of the room. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly. "I didn't hear you," she said, her voice just a touch colder. Rick's face flushed with embarrassment, the fire in his chest dimming as he realized the depth of his loss. His pride had been shattered, his strength no longer in question. "I'm sorry," he spat out, his voice sharp but undeniably sincere, though it took everything in him to say the words. His cheeks turned crimson, the apology feeling like a public confession. The rest of the bikers stood frozen, as though waiting for some signal that the ordeal was over. But it wasn't over yet. Rick had apologized, but it wasn't just about that. It was about respect. The bikers had to understand that their actions had consequences, real, undeniable consequences. The room fell into a heavy silence. The patrons, who had watched the entire scene unfold, now seemed to breathe collectively as if they had been holding their breath. They weren't just observing anymore, they were part of this moment. Emily had earned their respect, and they knew it. Mr. Baker, always the quiet one, was the first to break the silence. He gave Emily a shaky thumbs up, his usually timid smile now brimming with pride. He had witnessed the entire transformation from the beginning, the way Emily had handled the situation with poise, strength, and integrity. The young couple that had been sitting near the back of the diner smiled at Emily, their eyes filled with gratitude and admiration. They weren't just grateful for her courage, they were in awe of how she had carried herself. Emily wasn't just a waitress. She was a force to be reckoned with. Emily's gaze softened as she looked around the room, noting the quiet admiration in the eyes of the patrons. She had done what she had set out to do, not just defend herself but protect everyone else in the diner. The bikers, for all their bluster, had underestimated her, and in the end, they had been forced to face the consequences of their arrogance. She turned her back to the bikers, who were slowly gathering their things, still nursing their bruised egos. They didn't dare challenge her again. They had learned that lesson the hard way. "Anyone need a refill?" Emily asked, her voice light as she picked up the coffee pot and moved toward the counter. Her question sounded almost as if nothing had happened, as though the biker confrontation had been just another ordinary part of her day. She moved gracefully, smoothly, her every action reflecting the calm confidence that had become second nature to her over the years. Her father's lessons hadn't just been about physical strength, they had been about mental toughness, about handling the unexpected with grace and resilience. And Emily had learned that lesson well. The bikers had reached the door, and they didn't look back. Rick, despite his pride, knew the score. He knew when he was beaten. The door swung open with a creak, and the group shuffled out, their heavy boots echoing on the floor as they disappeared into the night. For a moment, everything was still. The buzz of conversation that had filled the diner earlier faded, replaced by a comfortable quiet that seemed to settle over the room like a blanket. The tension had been broken, and what was left in its wake was a feeling of calm satisfaction. The patrons had witnessed a battle of wills, and they had seen who came out on top. Emily wasn't just the quiet waitress anymore. She was a symbol of something bigger, a reminder that strength comes in many forms, and sometimes, it's the quietest person in the room who has the most power. As the door clicked shut, Emily turned back to face the room, her expression neutral but her eyes bright. She wasn't just returning to the mundane task of serving coffee, she was reclaiming her space, her power. She had fought for it, and now it was hers. The tension in the room had lifted, but the admiration for Emily remained. George stepped out from behind the kitchen counter, shaking his head with a grin. "You know," he said, half laughing, "I never would have guessed you had it in you." Emily raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Where's the fun in doing what people expect?" she replied casually, as if she hadn't just taken on a group of bikers and won. "You know, Emily," George said, his voice warm with appreciation, "you're something else." He paused, glancing at the door the bikers had just exited. "I think they'll think twice before coming back here." Emily nodded, glancing toward the door as if she could still feel their presence lingering. "They won't," she said, her voice steady, "because they'll know better. No one messes with my diner. No one messes with me." The other patrons, who had been watching quietly, now began to speak again, their voices filled with gratitude and respect. A quiet conversation buzzed through the diner as they began to realize what had just taken place, not just a confrontation with a group of bikers, but a moment of truth for all of them. They had been part of something important, something that had restored balance to a world where power often went unchecked. "Best cup of coffee I've ever had," Mr. Baker said, his voice finally steady. The young woman from the back table laughed softly. "You're not kidding," she said, her voice full of admiration. "That was like something out of a movie." Emily smiled, but there was no ego in it, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had done what needed to be done. She had stood her ground and protected the diner. And now, she could move on, knowing that justice had been served. As the last customer paid their bill and the lights flickered off, Emily closed the door behind them and turned the sign to closed. The diner was empty now, the chaos of the night behind her. But she knew it wouldn't be the last time someone underestimated her, and when that moment came, she'd be ready. She always would be. And with that, Emily stepped out into the cool night air, her heart light with the knowledge that sometimes, justice wasn't just about righting wrongs, it was about reclaiming what's yours and making sure everyone knows it. Emily stood at the door, her eyes following the bikers as they slowly disappeared down the road, their engines fading into the night. The heavy silence that had settled in the diner was now gone, replaced by a quiet hum of normalcy. The day was over, and the conflict had passed. She didn't need to watch them any longer. She knew what was in their minds as they rode away: the embarrassment, the anger, the defeat. They had come in thinking they could bully their way through, that their size and loud voices would carry the day. But that wasn't what happened. They hadn't counted on her. They hadn't counted on the strength she'd learned from years of quiet resilience, from watching her father, from understanding that power doesn't always announce itself. The last of the patrons paid their bills and drifted out, murmuring thanks as they left. Emily didn't need their praise, but she appreciated it. She had done what was right, what had needed to be done. And that was enough. But as she locked the door behind her, she couldn't help but reflect on the way things had played out. Her father's lessons were always simple but powerful. He had always told her that trouble comes in many forms. Sometimes, it comes with fists, other times with words, and sometimes, it's the quiet moments that hold the most danger. But, he had said, strength comes in many forms too. She stood outside the diner now, the cool breeze ruffling her hair, and she could feel it. The strength. It wasn't the kind of strength you could flex or show off. It wasn't in the size of your muscles or the volume of your voice. It was in the way you carried yourself, the way you held your ground when it mattered. It was knowing when to fight, and when to stand tall, quiet, and calm. As Emily leaned against the brick wall of the diner, she thought of her father. He had taught her more than self-defense. He had taught her the value of patience, of waiting for the right moment, of knowing when to act and when to stay still. He had taught her that strength isn't always loud, and sometimes, the strongest person in the room is the one who knows when to act and when to let others reveal their true colors. Her mind wandered to the bikers, to the way they had entered the diner with so much arrogance. They thought they could push people around, take control with their intimidation. They had been loud and aggressive, but that wasn't what made them strong. The fact that they had been so certain of their power was their biggest mistake. The moment they'd underestimated her, they had lost. Emily hadn't needed to prove anything. She hadn't needed to show them who she was or where she came from. But she had, and in doing so, she had reminded herself and everyone else that real power doesn't come from making noise. It comes from knowing who you are, standing firm, and choosing the right moment to make your move. The bikers had been powerful in their own way, but only because they had relied on intimidation. And when that power crumbled, when it met something that wasn't swayed by it, they were left with nothing. All their strength turned into fear. And now, as she stood outside, the world seemed a little quieter, a little more at peace. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out. A message from her dad. She smiled as she read the simple text, "Proud of you, Emily." Her heart warmed. The simple words meant the world to her. She hadn't needed anyone else's approval. But hearing that from her dad, that felt different. That felt right. He had always been her rock, always told her that the world would challenge her, but that she had the strength to face anything. As Emily stood there in the cool night air, her thoughts shifted again. The lessons her father had taught her weren't just for the big moments. They were for every day, for every time someone tried to push you around, for every moment when you needed to make a choice about how to stand your ground. And sometimes, the best way to show strength wasn't by fighting back. Sometimes, it was by showing that you didn't need to fight at all. That night, the diner had witnessed a transformation. But it wasn't just Emily who had changed. The people who had watched had seen what true strength looked like, strength that didn't rely on shouting or intimidation. It was the strength of patience, of control, and of knowing when to act. It was the strength of someone who could take whatever life threw at them and turn it into something better. And in that moment, Emily realized something. She had always known that her father's lessons would stay with her. She had always known that his quiet, solid strength would guide her. But tonight, she saw it in herself too. She had been tested, and she had passed with flying colors. She had not only protected herself but also everyone else in that diner. And in doing so, she had earned their respect, and her own. As she walked back into the diner to clean up, Emily felt different. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. The world had a way of testing you, pushing you to see what you were made of. And she had shown them. She had shown them that there's power in patience, in quiet confidence, in knowing when to stand tall, even when the world expects you to back down. She wiped down the counter slowly, her thoughts moving back to her father's lessons. He had always told her that the strongest person in the room isn't the one who makes the most noise. It's the one who stands firm, who stays true to themselves, and who doesn't back down when the moment comes. Emily smiled to herself. That was the kind of strength she could live with. It was the kind of strength that didn't need to be loud. It was the kind of strength that came from knowing who you were and standing by it. And in that moment, as she finished cleaning the counter and turned off the lights, she knew that she had earned something far more valuable than any victory. She had earned respect not just from the bikers, but from herself. And sometimes, that's all that really matters. As she walked out the door and locked it behind her, Emily looked up at the stars above. The world might be loud and chaotic, but tonight, it had quieted down just a little. And in that peace, Emily found a kind of strength that no one could take from her. Trouble comes in many forms. But so does strength. And sometimes, the strongest person in the room isn't the loudest. It's the one who knows when to act and when to wait. As Emily headed home, she felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had learned that lesson well.